Welcome, everybody. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, my name is John Gestel. I am our client relations coordinator here. Joining me is Dayton O'Connor, our lead analyst, and Rob Bernhardt, our corporate counsel, to answer your questions and talk through the Royalty Exchange. As I mentioned before, please use the Q&A option rather than the chat option for any submitted questions. We're going to run through the previously submitted questions for sign up and then open the floor for any questions you may have. So without further ado, we can just dive in here. First question that we have here is, what's the process of purchasing royalties? On Royalty Exchange, it's very straightforward. You confirm an asset purchase on the exchange. We send you paperwork, you send payment in, we confirm the reassignment with the seller, set you up in our admin portal, and then you just collect. So it's a very straightforward process. All of our agreements are standardized and viewable on our terms of use page. So purchase agreements, accounting agreements, all that stuff's viewable there. And that's really it. I mean, it's very, very straightforward. Rob, anything to add to the purchase process?
Nope.
Okay, perfect. Next one here. How can potential investors secure funding for investing in one of the royalty packages? That is a great question. Historically, there hasn't really been any way to finance a purchase like this, which is one of the reasons why Royalty Exchange exists. Because otherwise artists would be doing it and just collateralizing their royalty assets for a loan or something like that. If you do end up securing financing or something like this, we'd love to hear about it. But we have not heard of much success from anybody with the ability to do that. Next here, are you expecting the purchase price of royalties to decrease as the federal interest rates increase to maintain the return on investment? This is a really good question, especially with what happened last week with rates going up. We don't really know. There's not a good way for us to guess because these are pretty unique cash yielding assets. So, there are obviously similarities to bonds and things like that, but not a perfect correlation. I don't know, Dayton, you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, just to add to that piece, John, there's a number of things that could potentially happen. I think that what this asker is calling out for is what happens with bond prices and yields when interest rates increase, the bond of a price falls as the yields go up. It's reasonable to expect that could happen with these kinds of assets if you consider a royalty asset to behave the same way as a bond. There's no way of knowing that would be the case because there are a number of other different factors that are in play here. Investors may be drawn to these royalty assets because they want to invest in these alternate income streams that are uncorrelated with the market, that don't experience the same kind of volatility as other assets do. Say, if you are heavily into equities and you see what's happening in the stock market, you might want to, fly to safety, and a regular income stream like a royalty asset may look valuable to you. And if we have more people demanding more royalty assets, for that reason, you could expect the prices to go up. So what's going to happen with the price action over the next 6 to 12 months? It's unclear. There are a number of different factors at play.
Yeah, so stay tuned and watch the market. Next question we got here is, what should a beginner look for when starting their royalty investments? So we do have a couple basic pillars that we look at when evaluating any royalty asset. The dollar age is a big one. I'm sure you've seen that term on the site. Dollar age is effectively how we measure the consistency of an asset based on the life of its earning history. But it's a bit more complicated than that. So we've got a larger breakdown, again, on the blog page, which I recommend you take a look at. We tend to look at the sources and the earnings trends. Obviously, there are other factors that go into that. But those are kind of like the major pillars. Dayton can speak a bit more specifically to this as our lead analyst. So Dayton, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, you touched on dollar age. When you're looking at one of these assets, you'll also have the ability to take a look at the earnings that are tied to the asset. And you can evaluate the trends that are happening in those earnings. So that's also going to factor into your analysis when you're pricing this. You can see that there are different ways that different types of music are consumed across different platforms. So you can look by genre and have an expectation, say country music is going to be heavily indexed on radio, something like hip hop or pop is going to be heavier on streaming, and understand the different growth rates that are tied with those different income streams. Streaming you expect to go up at a pretty robust rate over time. Something with like radio that's driven by royalties, you would expect that to decrease over time or to level out. Looking at that data, that's going to be key also to making that kind of evaluation.
Bob, you have anything to add to that?
Nothing for me.
Great. Next one here is, can I purchase pieces of music royalties? So this gets to be a little complicated on royalty exchange because every asset that you see is inherently a portion of the overall royalties generated by the intellectual property. Now, that being said, any asset on royalty exchange does need to be purchased in its entirety. They're all one-to-one transactions. So like you can't throw $20 at like an Eminem catalog and get a portion of that. You'd have to buy that whole catalog. Rob, anything to elaborate there?
Yeah, exactly. What you see for sale is something you need to purchase the entire piece of.
Perfect. Next question we have here: upon purchasing the rights to a song, how does the profit process work over time? So I'm assuming this is a question on growth potential. Dayton, do you want to take that one? Talk about how these can grow.
Oh, couldn't unmute myself. The profit process over time. When we're talking about dollar age, the rule of thumb to bear in mind with these assets: younger, you have lower probabilities of there being a longer tail of future distributions, and you have a wider range of potential outcomes with that income stream. An older asset, higher dollar age, you can have more confidence in how that income stream looks going forward, given how it's performed historically over a longer period of time. In terms of the profit process, the way that these income streams can change over time, I touched on this when we discussed like valuing these assets. When you're considering where this money is coming from and knowing how those different income streams behave, if you have a catalog that is entirely built on streaming, people are consuming that asset, on a recurring basis, generally on demand if it's mostly on Spotify, Apple Music. And we know, based on market intelligence and reports that we get from analysts that are looking at the market, that the income and revenue that's tied to streaming services is expected to grow at a pretty robust pace over the next 10 to 15 years. Likely double-digit percentage growth year to year, in the near-term future. And that's going to translate to a similar level of growth in the income streams that are tied to music royalties that are generated by streaming, right? So it's possible that you could acquire an asset like that you would see that kind of growth from over time, as the rising tide lifting all boats at streaming brings the value of those distributions up. You can also potentially see catalogs be utilized in different ways over time. A catalog that gets placed in commercials or TV shows that starts to get sync opportunities. You may see that in the historic earnings when you're evaluating that asset. It's possible that kind of activity continues and might increase. That's a way that you can see that income growth grow over time as well. Those are just a couple examples.
Perfect. All right. Next question that we have here: how much would you need for an initial startup? How much do you need to put on a royalty? So our price range is pretty huge. Typically we stay on the low end. You should expect assets to transact somewhere in like the 5,000 to 10,000 US dollar range. That's normally what we see. Occasionally you might find stuff under 5,000, but it's pretty rare. So general rule of thumb here: normally we need to see at least $1,000 earned from a catalog in the last 12-month period for us to move forward with a listing. That's kind of our baseline. And then expect you're paying some multiple of that. So depending on if the term length, that can impact the multiple, but normally it's going to be like 2, 3, 4, 5x at a minimum. Again, totally depends on the catalog and what people are willing to pay for it, but it's kind of a good general rule of thumb for assets that you'll find. Next question here: I couldn't work out how to search X musicians in the user interface. So we use a tagging system to denote artists in any given catalog, because many of these catalogs are vast with hundreds to thousands of works from hundreds to thousands of different artists. So we're working on a text search function right now, so you should expect to see that in the coming months, as well as a bunch of other quality of life updates to the exchange. For now, I would just say do a simple search function in your browser just to find keywords, but that's going to be an imperfect system for searching a specific artist. You're better off searching by your budget range. A lot of the functionality on the exchange right now is based on purchase price because we have such a wide range of asset prices. So things like LTM, dollar age, list price, those are all like the primary search functions. So I would say focus on that and then see what's in your range. If the artist you're looking for is there, normally there'll be a tag for it for any given catalog. Next one we have here, how can I find new and cheap royalties? Same answer, use the search function via price. We also will tag new assets with a literal new tag, as well as any active sellers will get an active owner tag. And then we have a set time every day where new assets go live. So every day at 10 a.m. Mountain, 9 a.m. Pacific, and that ends up being what, the noon Eastern. That's when new assets go live. So if you check back on the site at that time, that's when new stuff goes up. So if you want to just check back daily and see what comes up, that's the time to do it. Next one here, how to search on the website. I think we've covered that. Next one, I'd like to know more in general overall and what types of royalties are available through Royalty Exchange. Well, we really cover all music royalty types effectively, but really what's available can vary depending on what artists we're working with, what investors are looking to sell, and any number of factors. And then we'll also work with royalties outside of music, things like film royalties. I'm sure many of you have seen the Listerine trademark royalties or copyright, brand copyright usage. That's up there. The Ben & Jerry's Cherry Garcia royalties is always a popular one that comes up. So you'll see lots of different stuff. Dayton or Rob, do you guys have anything that you want to add to that? Right. Next one here. What percentage of rights bought at auction have then been resold on the exchange? It's a good question. I'm not sure that I know the actual figure. Either of you guys know?
I don't know the number. I think the vast majority of them are automatically relisted. If Royalty Exchange is handling the administration of payments. Now, the number that have been resold, I don't think I have that. I don't think I've seen that recently.
Yeah, I don't know that one offhand. I can say that the resale activity is increasing, that more people are having their assets be listed, as John mentioned, and then people are coming in and buying that. And I've also seen a few instances already of people who have acquired assets that were previously resold on the exchange. So you've already got that chain of transactions that's occurring.
Mm-hmm. And on top of all of that, as we are actively developing, we're adding more royalty payors, which is allowing us to add more stuff to the exchange, so that pool is constantly growing as well. So yeah, it's always growing. Next question here is, what percentage of the entire royalties for a given song would I be getting? So that entirely depends on the asset that you're looking at. As we mentioned earlier, typically this is just a portion. So an individual songwriters or producers share of the royalties generated by the IP, and then whatever rights they include, then brings that even lower or smaller rather. So it varies. Often we're seeing sellers sell 100% of their specific royalty share, but it varies. It's totally up to the artist and what they want to do. That information would be listed on your purchase agreement, but again, that is specifically the seller's share and not indicative of the overall royalties paid out by any intellectual property, which is an important distinction. Dayton, Rob, anything you guys want to add to that?
Nope, I covered it.
Perfect. Next one here, will you be selling parts of a whole, like on Robinhood, you can buy $20 worth of a stock and then add to it? So like we said earlier, any asset on Royalty Exchange does have to be purchased in its entirety. They are all one-to-one transactions. So no, you cannot do that. We do not securitize these. They are not securities. So the only opportunity where you would have something like that would be through our private syndicates. These are pure securities, so only available to accredited investors. We do them pretty rarely, but they do come up. So that would be the only opportunity for something like that where you're buying a portion. Next one here, why do valuations make 0 sense? I think I would need a little bit more context to understand what you're asking. We are extremely data-driven with our valuations based on how the markets behave, based on all the contributing factors we mentioned earlier about how we do evaluation, the dollar age, the earnings, the trends, the sources, all of that goes into it. So it's very logical. So I don't know how you could say they make 0 sense. I don't know, Dayton, do you have anything that you want to say in response to that?
No, I mean, I think that if you're looking at our platform to date, the market has spoken. The market is telling you through the price action how much these different assets are worth.
Okay, next one here. How can you tell if a particular royalty is worth investing in? Well, this is kind of the $1 million question, isn't it? Right? Like, how do you know what a good investment is? Again, we would point to those key pillars that we focus on for our valuations as far as understanding the asset. But ultimately, if something's worth investing in is really up to you, your investment goals, and what you want in your portfolio. So we can't really answer that for you. We are not financial advisors, so we couldn't even tell you what is worth it for you. We would just show you the data and say, if this data fits with what you're looking for, then great. Yeah, Rob, I don't know if you have any data that, Dayton.
Nope.
What is the best genre of music to start investing in? Again, not really something we can offer for you. We do see different behaviors from different genres, but ultimately no one is superior to the other. It all is about what fits best in your portfolio. So again, we would point you towards the earnings trends, the dollar age, the sources, all that good stuff, and say make your decision based off of that. Next one here, what type of activity can investors do after they win a bid to increase the uptake of their assets and generate income? Great question. Rob, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So almost all assets for sale on Royalty Exchange are going to be a purely passive income asset, which means that if you purchase it, you're not going to have licensing authority. That will typically lie with whoever is the publisher of a musical composition or the label for a sound recording. So aside from knowing a music supervisor in film and TV and putting a bug in their ear to get songs that you've purchased into their productions, you could create a Spotify bot to put a song on repeat for infinity. That'll maybe make you 18 cents a year. But
no, can you do that?
I don't know. I don't know that anyone's actually done that. I wouldn't be surprised. But the key is that the rights on Royalty Exchange are purely passive income assets, and you're not going to have any licensing authority to actually to monetize it further.
Awesome. Next question here. How and what will I receive once a transaction is made to buy a song's royalties and to own royalties without the exchange afterwards? So in short, that's our purchase agreement. But Rob, you want to dive into that?
Right. So as soon as an offer is accepted on Royalty Exchange, we send out the purchase agreement and an invoice. The purchase agreement is what assigns the actual rights to that royalty income from the royalty owner to whoever the investor is. At that point, Royalty Exchange facilitates the paperwork with the underlying royalty distributor. So then Royalty Exchange will act as administrator of those payments. The distributor pays Royalty Exchange, and then Royalty Exchange pays the investor.
Next question here. Why are royalties so expensive? Well, in short, the price again is derived from the earnings history. So if it's earning a lot, it'll be worth more money. These things can earn lots of money every year. So, getting access to that cash flow can have a good price tag on it. Next one here, am I purchasing just the songwriter's share of the publishing royalty? So the rights included with any of our catalogs can vary. Sometimes the songwriter share, sometimes the publisher share. I mean, it depends on the asset, depends on the seller, depends on the entitlement that's for sale. It totally depends. Dayton, Rob, anything you guys want to add to that?
Well, just to be clear, each listing will tell you exactly what share of royalties is for sale. So it'll say this is part of the composition, it's a public performance right, and then who the actual participant is. Is it the songwriter's share? Is it the publisher's share? Is it in the terms of a sound recording? Is it a label share, producer share, recording artist share? All that information will be on every listing on Royalty Exchange. But I will say that I would say the majority, pretty good majority, seems to come from public performance for songwriters, from mostly ASCAP and BMI, is I would say probably the majority of our assets.
Next one here, how do I calculate ROI in music investment? Dayton, you want to talk about returns and how we calculate that?
Sure. I mean, it depends on the kind of transaction that you're doing, right? Because for a typical asset, if you're acquiring that, then it's a function of how much royalty income you're earning over time against how much you paid for it. This can be complicated by, how long you intend to hold that asset for, the term of that asset. We do deals typically for either 10-year or I think more commonly life of rights. And you can also factor into that your return potential resale activity. We touched on resales earlier on in this conversation. Consider the fact that there's a lot of people and one kind of investment strategy you may undertake, buying an asset, holding it for a couple of quarters to get the benefit of those distributions that you collect on, relist it on the platform, and then sell it at a price that could potentially be higher than what you would acquired it for. So that's all playing into your potential return on your initial investment.
Next question here. What is the best strategy for getting your bid accepted? That's a tough question. Different investors approach the market differently. Ultimately, we always encourage you to always make counter offers rather than declines, because that's what the exchange is built for, price discovery and your ability to negotiate. So I would say a good strategy is determining what your ceiling is and then counter offering so that you can get somewhere near or maybe below your ceiling, depending on how the seller is behaving. But ultimately, being active and responsive to any counter offers that you get is normally the best approach. Ultimately, if some seller isn't having success or their price too high, and they adjust their purchase price, their list price, something like that, you want to be a part of that conversation. And the best way to be a part of that conversation is by having active offers for that seller. So being active, making offers, making counters, that's normally the best approach. Dana, Rob, I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
Nope.
Great. Next question here. Do you have a list of movie royalties and soundtrack royalties as well? Not a formal list, they're just in the mix, but we do have plenty of film, TV royalties. I'm sure many of you saw the Shrek film music that sold, I think it was last year sometime. So yeah, movie stuff comes up all the time. So just keep an eye out for it. Normally something like that would make it onto our featured section. Just because it's a little bit unique. So, the featured list, it's always good to keep an eye on that. Next question here. No problem with purchase being made by non-US citizens. Rob, you want to talk about international buying?
Sure. Yeah. No. Any international citizen can participate in Royalty Exchange. I think as long as it doesn't come from a country that doesn't accept bank transfers. But typically, any foreign individual can purchase on royalty exchange. One thing you want to keep in mind is the tax treaties that you have between your home country and the U.S. As if the royalties are originated in the U.S., then royalty exchange would be a withholding agent for taxes. So depending on what the treaty is between your country and the U.S., we may have to withhold a certain percentage of royalties. You certainly want to check with your tax advisor for that. How that's handled is you'll send us a W-8BEN form. Any purchaser on royalty exchange will have to send us a tax form, and then we'll handle that accordingly.
Perfect. Next one here. Why do you make money for holding music royalties? In short, because as people listen to the music, they generate royalties, and that gets paid out to whoever owns the royalty rights. So if you are the owner, then you have the right to collect those royalty payments. And that's what we're doing here. We're aggregating those payments for that intellectual property and paying to whoever owns the rights. So that's it in a nutshell. I mean, I don't know, Robert, Dayton, you guys have anything you want to elaborate on there?
No, I mean, I think that it's pretty succinct, John.
Yeah. Next one here. How long does it take to complete a deal? Rob, you want to talk about our deal flow?
Yeah, so it's kind of dependent on the distributor, but I would say, again, for the majority of the deals that are there as kept in BMI, an offer will be accepted. The invoice and purchase agreement will go out. The investor has 2 days to send the funds. Parties have 2 days to sign the agreements. At that point, once we have the funds in hand, that's when we'll facilitate the actual paperwork with the distributor. Those can, and then what we do is we withhold 10% of the seller's proceeds to make sure that the assignment goes through. So once we have all of the paperwork in hand, we have the seller's proceeds with the buyer's funds, then we have the distributor confirm that assignment is in place. So that's when we release to the seller the first 90% of their proceeds. And then we hold an additional 10 until that next payment comes out, just to make sure the payment is flowing to royalty exchange correctly. And we can use that to kind of debit credit if we find any issues that we can address with the distributor directly. The initial confirmation and payment of proceeds usually takes, 1 or 2 weeks. For a PRO style deal, publishers could take maybe another week or two longer than that. But typically it's probably in the 2-week range.
And the only exceptions to that might be like a matching right, which we do see from time to time. It's case by case when we see those. That could have different periods, lengths of time post-transaction where we would need to learn if the publisher or whoever wants to invoke their matching right. Some could be as short as 10 days, some could be as long as 60 days. But you'll always see a note about anything like that that might impact a transaction. Will always be on a listing. So just make sure you read the listings. Next question here. Are there master recording royalties available for purchase or generally only publishing? So it's not very often that we include master recordings. As we were mentioning earlier, royalty exchange is meant to be passive income, and control of the masters implies a little bit of a larger obligation. We have in the past sold assets that did include masters, copyright control, things like that. It's not very often. I don't know, Rob, you want to have anything to add to that?
Well, just to clarify, if you're talking about just royalties from the master sound recording copyright, yeah, we won't sell the actual master's copyrights, but we do very often sell royalties from that side of the copyright, from the sound recording. So oftentimes there'll be a producer's share or a recording artist's share that you'll see on royalty exchange. And again, that'll be listed on each listing on which share is available and from which copyright that's derived.
Next question here. How do you ensure sufficient liquidity on the platform? Great question. So that's what the exchange is for, providing liquidity. That's also why we'll automatically relist any eligible asset on the exchange on behalf of asset holders. There's no obligation to sell by having your asset up there, but it allows you the option to liquidate if you need to. But the thing to keep in mind is it's an open market. So your ability to liquidate your asset depends on, how you respond to offers you receive, the price you set, things like that. So we ensure liquidity just by making sure everything is available to view and purchase. Obviously, if your asset's up there and you don't want it out there, we can take it down for you, but we don't recommend that. You never know who's going to come in with a crazy offer you can't refuse, right? You want to be open to those opportunities. So we always say leave it up. You don't have to take any offers you get. You can set a minimum offer amount so you don't get bugged by low balls. I mean, there's a lot of functionality there. Dayton or Rob, anything you guys want to add to that for liquidity? No, perfect. Rob, do you have something? No? Okay, great. Next question here. How often are auctions held? Less and less these days. Ultimately, the medium of sale is up to the seller and what they want to do. We still can and will host auctions. But it seems that these days, most sellers are more drawn to the negotiation ability of the exchange and being able to set a list price, not being tied to the result of an auction. Those are all really attractive for sellers. So most will opt for listing on the exchange. But that being said, our ability to list stuff on the exchange has opened up a lot more opportunity for investors as far as asset quality type, stuff like that. So it really is to everyone's benefit that we go through the exchange, but we can still do auctions. They're just rarer. Next question here. How can buy the royalties I buy? How will people know about my royalty and my music? I'm not sure about that second question. That sounds like it's coming from someone looking to sell. I don't really understand that question. I don't know if either of you guys understand that one. It seems like a weird one. We'll skip it. How are payments made to investors outside of the USA? Rob, you want to talk more about international stuff?
Yeah, same deal like I mentioned earlier. Check your the tax treaty with your home country. Check your you'll have to supply a WAVN, so Royalty Exchange will collect the money, and then we'll send it typically via direct deposit through a service called Payment Hub.
That's our admin portal for those of you who are curious. Next, how do you receive money from the royalties? Like Rob just mentioned, through Payment Hub, you set up your banking information and we send the money to you at whatever account you specify. Next question here. Are people who don't have a list price at all interested in selling on the exchange? This is actually a great question. Sometimes they are. I would say, aside from looking at the list price, also look at how they've responded to offers in the past. If they've just ignored everything, even though they're getting what seem to be pretty compelling offers, it's probably a good indication that they're not looking to sell. If everything's just declined, they probably have a really high offer minimum, in which case, yeah, they're probably not looking to sell. While the list price is a good indication of someone's willingness to sell, it's not the only way. So really take all of the behavior you see on a listing into account. Rob, Dayton, anything you guys want to add to that? No? Okay, great. Why is there a $5,000 joining fee? So there isn't. I'm going to assume that this is someone who is misunderstanding our all access membership, which has a $4,997 sign-up fee. But you don't need to be an all access member to participate in Royalty Exchange. You just need to get verified as an investor, which is very straightforward. Submit a form. Now, the all access membership can have a lot of perks, depending on what your strategy and what you're trying to get accomplished. It might be right for you. One of the big perks is that we waive our buyer's fee, and that can be pretty significant if you're active on the site or buying expensive assets. So there are a lot of perks with it. I would recommend go looking at that page and reading about it. But in short, you don't need the all access membership to participate. Next question here. What's the main difference between investing on Royalty Exchange versus your sister site, Songvest? So Songvest is not actually our sister site. It's the guy who founded that used to work here. And I believe he's got something in his bio about Royalty Exchange or something like that. But there is one primary difference that is important to point out, and that Songvest is securitized royalty assets. So typically you're buying very small portions of a single catalog. Whereas in Royalty Exchange, you're buying a whole catalog. So pretty different in that regard. Rob, Dayton, anything you guys want to add to the difference between Songvest and us?
No.
Perfect. Other than that, I would say general asset selection, our pool's pretty huge. And as I understand it, they don't have a ton of options available, but I don't check their site very often. So that could change. How much money is in this market? What have been the growth trends in money coming into this market? How much money is in this market? That's tough to answer depending on how you want to conceptualize it. Music business as a whole, do you know the size of music business? I think it's a couple 100 billion, right? On royalty exchange, man, I don't even know. Yeah, either of you guys know how?
I haven't seen recent numbers, but you know, each of the PROs pretty much every year will say, hey, here's how much we paid out to artists. That's kind of a good indicator of, you can kind of think about it, you know, here's how much we paid out. And then if you can extrapolate it a little bit to the other types of royalties based on what you know about the percentages of how much PROs handle. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I know that they do put numbers out about how much money that they pay out in royalties.
Yeah, Goldman Sachs is a good release in that every year too.
Yeah, to that point, Rob, like ASCAP and BMI anymore, they'll typically put out an annual report where they indicate they've distributed over $1 billion in royalties. And the PROs themselves, they only make up like a small slice of like the overall like music revenue. Now, I mean, I don't know what the market size is for like the overall like music asset investment landscape. That's something that you can do that research on yourself. I just know that when you're going through Billboard Music Business Worldwide, those you know, industry trade publications, you know, you'll see references to a lot of like private equity and venture capital coming into the space, you know, backing a fund or buying a fund, working with a fund to acquire these different assets. You know, that may have changed recently. With the, you know, changing interest rate environment, that may have affected what that outlook looks like for, you know, the near term future, but the growth has been really significant, especially up until like the past year or so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure many, if not all of you, I remember seeing Bob Dylan sell his catalog for hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So just to give you a pretty much jumping off point. But yeah, big and growing. Next question here. Can royalties be bought in a crowdfunding format, i.e. investors buy a share of a royalty, not on royalty exchange? Again, with that, we're getting into securitization, which is not something that we offer. That's how we can keep the market open to, you know, retail investors, stuff like that. Not to say that there aren't opportunities for that in the world, we don't do it on royalty exchange. Dayton or Rob, anything you want to add to that?
Nope.
Is there a sample pricing model available? Dayton, thoughts?
One that we've put out, I'm not aware of one. I don't think so. You can see, if you were to take a look at an auction listing, for example, there is a set of cash flows that's generated in the financial section that'll, you know, point to how we're arriving at the values that are tied to the asset. If you're trying to price out these music assets yourself, I would suggest that, you know, you may want to start with a model of discounted cash flows over a, you know, the term of the period that you're looking at for a given asset to potentially price that out.
Next question here, somewhat related. How best to determine life of royalty or predict decline? Again, discounted cash flows, and we have an article on how you can amortize the cash flow life of these, setting a, you know, fixed decline, fixed decay rate, stuff like that. You can also do a variable decay rate. There's a couple different ways to approach it, but we have articles on that. Dayton, anything you want to elaborate on with how we look at decay?
Yeah, I mean, again, you look at dollar age, how an asset has performed in the historic earnings, and the age of that asset is a strong indicator of how it's going to perform in the future. If something is a 10-year-old catalog full of a number of songs that have been consumed and performed on a pretty regular basis, it's reasonable to expect that you're going to see similar levels of performance in the future. Now, again, we've talked about genre, we've talked about different, you know, different income streams that go into a royalty asset, how those can perform. you can expect that, maybe streaming is likely going to have increases over time because of the money that is going into streaming services. Other types of assets, we talked about radio is potentially a declining medium. We look at TV assets, which are, we sell those. It's, there's music that's tied to film and TV programs. There's also film assets. Those can also have different types of life cycles in terms of how those royalties are being generated over time, whether they're going to, TV or streaming services, or if they were, in theaters, and we're looking at participations that are tied to a theatrical release. Those are all going to be factors that you need to be mindful of when you're looking at how like a royalty asset may decline over time. That being said, it's possible that these assets may increase in value over time. If this is something I've seen more historically, but I remember looking at distributions that were tied to assets that have been around for songs that are 20, 30, 40 years old, that start to see their second life on streaming, and you can see those distributions begin to pick up. If an audience finds a track, that can lead to growth over time. In the normal course, I would expect older catalog likely to have steady performances. Younger catalog, you have a lot more risk that's built into that. If you're buying something that is a year, 2 years, 3 years, you're likely seeing the peak performances that have been paid out in the historic distributions that are tied to the asset. And so it's a question of what that decay looks like. If we're talking about, say, a non-single release at streaming, you might expect that by that point, maybe 3, 4, 5 years out, that the distributions have normalized. It's likely going to be flat, probably decreasing over time as those people listen to the song. Okay, if you're looking at, say, a radio single for a track that's maybe 2, 3 years old, where you're looking at the peak radio payout, that song may be picked up at radio and may enter into the playlists for those stations and be something that airs on a recurrent basis, airing over an indefinite period, or that song may just leave the chart completely. And the programmers want to put new music onto the radio station. That happens, across the country for whatever the genre is, and that song disappears. And it doesn't get picked up by streaming or by some other, usage. Other platforms are performing it, and the income for that may potentially dry up. When you're looking at those younger assets, there's a much wider range of potential outcomes that you could see, especially if we're talking about the decline of an asset. It can be really precipitous.
And again, like Dayton was mentioning, that's why source is so important. So that's why we always suggest looking at the source of the earnings. So yeah, that encapsulates that. Next question we have here is historical data available beyond the last 3 years? Yes, it is. On every listing, we will include the full historical raw data file that you can review. On our general summary page, we'll look at a 3-year earnings average, as well as about a 3-year history period by period. But the full data is available. Everything that we have is there, and that comes directly from the royalty payor. So it's direct from the source. So yes, that information is available. Next question here, what is the procedure to purchase songs? We've covered that quite a bit, so I would say go back and review the recording. How can I incorporate music royalty investing into real estate? I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, you could definitely find parallels between real estate investments and royalty investments. In that they're both cash yielding assets, but one is tangible, one is intangible. So there's pretty defined differences. I think I need a little bit more context to be able to answer your question, whoever asked that one. I don't know, Dayton or Rob, if you guys have anything you want to touch on with that. Yeah, tough one. Next one here, how can I get the rights to underground hip hop music? We have lots of hip hop. It comes up all the time. Underground stuff, I'm not certain. We can't really control for that. The artists we work with are interested in selling. So, and also they have a history of royalty earnings. Underground hip hop may not be generating royalties since it's underground. So there's also the possibility that we cannot list it because it isn't earning. So yeah, I mean, if there's a specific artist that you're interested in buying the rights to, I'd say send them over to us, send us the name. You know, we do have full-time staff that can reach out to artists and gauge their interest in possibly doing a royalty sale. But we can't promise it. Dave, you look like you had something you wanted to add there. No? Okay.
You touched on everything that I want to mention. If it's underground, it's probably not making money, so we probably wouldn't list it.
That's kind of the long and short of it. Next one here, how are royalties taxed? Rob, you want to talk about taxes?
Yeah, so it's in the U.S. the tax is ordinary income on a 1099, which royalty exchange will send out every year for all the royalties that we collect on your behalf and then pay through to you.
Simple and easy. Next question here, how does one assess potential investment return on various opportunities? Is there historical data available? So again, you know, assessing potential investment return, it's kind of the $1 million question. So we'll provide you all the data we can to help you determine what is the best return for you and, you know, understand what might happen with an asset in the future. All of the historical data is available. That goes from transactions on the site, history of earnings, the raw data, all that's available. That's all I have to say about that. I mean, Dayton, you have anything to add?
Yeah, we periodically take a look at return on the assets, typically around 11%. And we've touched on, I think, a few times already in this conversation, the ways that you can get your return from these music royalties. You buy it, you hold it. So you're collecting those distributions over time. That could be your entire return. If you're buying that for a life rights asset, then you're getting those distributions for an indefinite period, whatever the life of the copyright is, which is currently life of the author plus 70 years. So you could say basically forever if you're buying it from an author who's still alive. You can also potentially add to that investment if you decide to relist the asset and you sell on the platform. So your return could be the distributions that you collected while you held the asset and then whatever you sold that asset for. And we do see people are oftentimes reselling their assets for prices that are higher than what they acquired it for previously.
That's a next one here. Usually, how long will it take to liquidate an asset? I'm not sure we could give you a usually for that because it really depends on you and how active you are with the sale and, you know, what is your sale price that you need. So it could be really fast. It could be just a day, or it could take weeks, or it could take months, depending on how you respond to offers you get. And also depending on the offers you get. So yeah, timing can vary. Next question here, who provides the historical royalty information and who verifies it? Is it audited or self-reported? So we touched on this a little bit, but Rob, you want to get into the nitty-gritty?
Sure, yeah, so in order to list an asset on royalty exchange, the seller royalty owner will first contact us. A lot of times what they'll do is actually connect their royalty account to our portal. And then what we can do is we can analyze the statements that come directly from the distributor. So maybe when we first have the conversation with them, they might send over a few statements self-reported. But in order to ask an asset to actually get listed on royalty exchange has to pull those statements themselves directly from the distributor. So that's how we verify that we're actually getting the correct and complete information.
Next one here. What is the average annual return on music royalty investments? Dayton was just talking about this. Right now, it's sitting at around 11% site-wide, but you know, your individual experience may vary. Depends on the price you pay for the asset, how it performs moving forward. We can't make any claims or guarantees to future performance royalty assets. These are just the averages that we see on the market. Anything you want to add there?
Nope.
No. Perfect. All right, and last one here for the submitted questions. How do you find new artists? So I'm going to assume that this question is about how do we find artists that want to sell. Most artists that come to us are actually referrals from other artists who had a good experience with us, whether that's, you know, they were happy with the sale, the process, or whatever. So a lot of it is referrals, but as I did mention before, we do have full-time staff that is, you know, prospecting, reaching out to artists, seeing if they'd be interested, learning about the opportunities on royalty exchange, things like that. So it's a combination of a lot of different things. As the market grows, as more people learn about royalty exchange, more artists, but more and more artists come to us looking for opportunities. So it's kind of a constantly growing cycle. Yeah, anything you guys want to add to that? No, great. Okay, so that's it for the submitted questions. Now we're going to move on to the Q&A stuff. Remember, if you do have questions, send them to Q&A. It's just a little bit easier for us to manage here. First one we have here, is there any way to use the site to find lower price royalties? The site seems very limited. Yeah, so you're going to want to use the filters and the sliders at the top of the exchange. You can filter by price there. So you can filter by list price, you can filter by last 12 months of earnings. There are some pre-built filters which you can look at. So there's a lot of options, but yeah, it's all at the filter options on the exchange. Next one here, please explain what dollar age means. It makes little sense. So kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. The dollar age is effectively a metric we use to help to determine the consistency of earnings over time. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that. There are different weighted aspects to the formula and all that. But that's essentially what it is and how we look at it. Dayton, do you want to kind of elaborate on how we look at dollar age in a little bit more specific detail?
Sure. The dollar age is basically the age of the asset itself, how old that catalog is. The way that we can calculate dollar age is by taking a look at the release dates for the different tracks that are tied into a catalog, and look at a weighted average of those different releases based on, against the earnings for those different tracks. So if you have a catalog of 10 tracks, and each of those tracks came out sometime over the past 1 to 5 years, that weighted average based on those different release dates is going to calculate to what that dollar age is. And the way that we're looking at dollar age is it's an indication of the probability of the likelihood that a catalog is going to generate a certain level of performances over time. Higher dollar age, more likely that catalog is going to perform in line with the recent historic earnings than a lower dollar age asset. Because with a lower dollar age asset, there's less historic data for us to rely on. It hasn't been established what that long-term earnings trend looks like.
Right. And
Yeah,
again,
so just kind of as an example, so say you have 2 songs. One has been earning for 10 years. It makes up 90% of the earnings. One has been earning for 1 year. It makes up 10% of the earnings. The dollar age is going to be way closer to 10 years because it's weighted by the earnings of the bigger track that has been earning longer is going to weigh in more than the track has been earning less.
Right. And again, on the blog page on Royalty Exchange, there's a section that's dedicated to investors, and we have breakdowns to the dollar age with even more detail than that. We have the formula there for how we calculate it. All the information you can need is there. So take a look at that. That's going to be the best explainer description that we can offer you. So yeah, take a look at that article. Next one here, when looking at LTM multiples, it seems the most important factor is the 10-year versus life of rights feature. Is there any literature on pricing formulas for these 2 types of assets? For example, I noticed that on the website, you make some assumptions on liquidation value after 10 years. Is there some precedent for doing this for other kinds of assets? So that 10-year resale cash flow you were saying is for calculating a theoretical IRR specifically. That's just a simple IRR calculation, assuming a resale at year 10. So that's what that is. But for LTM multiples, yeah, the term length has a huge factor. If something's only viable for 10 years, you're not going to get a 10x on that because there's no return upside that you can see really. Compared to life of rights, which is a much longer period, your return profile becomes much higher. So yeah, that's a huge difference there. Dayton, do you want to dig into this a little bit?
Yeah, just to expand a little bit on the life of rights for the liquidation value after 10 years. That's equivalent to a terminal value, right? We're using that a multiple and that year 10 cash flow to establish what the rest of the earnings of the life of the asset are potentially going to look like.
Sasha, I hope that answers your question. If you need more details there, just shoot me a note. Next question here, wondering about how taxes work on the platform, mainly for international investors. So we did touch on this already. Rob, do you want to just go over taxes again for international investors?
Sure. Yep. So when you purchase an asset on Royalty Exchange will then be the administrator of payments. We'll collect those payments and we'll ask you, the investor, for a tax form called a W-8 BEN. That's where you'll enter your information in your home country. There's a section there to claim whatever the tax treaty is between the US and your country. Oftentimes it's 0, sometimes it's 5 or 10%, and that amount is the amount that we will have to withhold for US taxes on those earnings for US based royalties.
Next one here, is there more liquidity on the primary market when the asset first gets sold or on the secondary market when the asset owners trade with each other? What are the pros and cons in each of these markets? I would say that assets are more liquid at their origination point compared to their resale point. And that's mainly because many investors adopt the strategy of buy and hold. Whereas, an originating seller, normally the original rights holder, they are actively looking for a sale. So I would say that's the main difference. But again, that's a pretty broad generalization and not necessarily true depending on the asset. There are some investors who adopt the strategy of buying with intent to sell later. So it really depends on the asset and who owns it and what they're trying to do. I don't know, Robert, Dayton, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that it's the same market. It's just different participants, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're a motivated seller, you're going to get liquidity, right? I mean, it depends on what your expectations are, and what the market says your asset is worth. But I think the markets are really the same, just kind of slightly different people participating for different reasons.
Right.
Right. Any asset that gets bought can be relisted on the exchange. We're going to indicate on that asset whether that is something that is being sold for the first time or has been previously sold. We can point to the sales history, what that was acquired for, at what point of time. I think it includes a link to that past listing itself.
Yep, it does.
So it's a single market. It's my view.
Yeah. Ultimately, the biggest takeaway is it depends on the seller and their motivations. Ultimately. Next one here is dollar age only based on streaming income, streaming/income from streaming, and is that trend still increasing? Heard subs/Netflix, etc., are decreasing. Isn't music streaming likely to follow overall streaming trends? So dollar age is not only based on streaming. That's just one of the contributing income points. So that's not the only thing. Streaming is still increasing. Spotify has posted like record numbers in the last quarter, I think, for the Q1 reporting. Now, this Netflix point, comparing Netflix to music streaming, actually, Dayton and I have had a number of conversations about this in the last couple of weeks. They're not really the same. They're different pricing models and they're different consumptions of intellectual property. So yeah, Netflix is showing a decrease in subscribership. A lot of that's based off of what's been going on in Russia and Ukraine. They lost a lot from that. But Spotify isn't taking that same hit. Dayton, you want to kind of dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, let's pull back a little bit, because if we're talking about like subs and Netflix declining, fine. I think that there's probably a lot of people on the call who saw what happened to the price of Netflix stock over the past year, especially with their most recent earnings report, where, as John was mentioning, you see that their subscribership has been basically flat, ticked down a little bit in the most recent quarter, and their forecasts for future subscribers are a lot less rosy than what they were looking at a year or so ago. Now, specific, I think, just to back away a little bit from like the music conversation and all that, specific to Netflix and their model, there's a lot of competition in streaming for AV, right? There's Netflix, there's Hulu, now there's Peacock, there's new platforms that are popping up all the time. So there are new different sources and services that are eating into Netflix's specific market share. Does that mean that the total market of AV over the top streaming is decreasing? I don't think so. I think that's still expected to grow, especially as you enter into new markets. I don't think that the US is totally saturated yet. It's just that Netflix, uh, you know, it may be the case, not saying this is what's happening, but they're probably experiencing more competition. And that's why they're having some, challenges that are specific to their business. And then you can take that to what happens in like the audio streaming space, the Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music is the new one that's popping up. It's not nearly as fragmented a marketplace. That all being said, if we move away from what's happening with specific businesses and touch on what's happening with like the larger macro like music consumption picture, streaming is going up. Streaming is expected going up. Spotify thinks that their market share has been increasing. They expect it to continue to increase. So they have a bullish view on themselves as a company and also in the space that they're operating in. And that's probably not going to be changing. So I may be wrong about like what's happening with like the AV OTT space because that's not my like domain of expertise. But I think that space continues to grow. The audio streaming is expected to grow as well. It's just that you may see like different companies get challenged with how much revenue they're bringing in, but that's not necessarily a negative for future distributions because as more services come on, those services will be licensed and then we'll start to pay through royalties depending on what asset you've acquired. If you bought something that's getting played on an audio streaming platform.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question ultimately. But yeah, I mean, streaming is still growing and the royalty generation from streaming is still going to happen with competition from things like Spotify. So you're still going to earn from it. Hopefully that answered your question. Next one here, this looks like more of a statement. Those search functions are very poor. They don't take into account how many offers have been rejected at very high offers. Well, I mean, for that, you could just look at the offer history. That's always available. So if it's something you're interested in, you could just look and see all the rejected offers. If there's a question there, I would say send it in again because I'm not really sure how to take that. Next one here, which music genre is most liquid to date? I'm not sure that we could answer that. Dayton, do you know?
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever seen any figures on stuff like that. I know based on some research I've seen that I think in the overall music market acquisition space that most of the activity has been on these classic rock catalogs. Does that mean they're the most liquid? Perhaps, but I don't know if those kind of figures are available.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Next one here, can you give us any sort of high level preview of what an analyst benchmark actually looks like? Yeah, we can actually. This is the analyst benchmark is effectively the median market sale price for assets of a certain dollar range and a similar earnings profile. So it is exclusively that, a benchmark. It is not a true valuation of the asset. The value can be greater or lower depending on what the asset is. So it's really just a jumping off point based on the market and how the market has responded to similar assets. Dayton, do you have anything that you want to elaborate on there?
I mean, the analyst benchmark is driven by past transaction history for those different types of assets. And I was just thinking, is it the case that do we have like a little hover over on a given listing for the analyst benchmark that gives a little explainer up to what that looks like?
There is, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's easy to miss, so I understand. But yeah, that'll say effectively the same thing. It's a median sale price of similar assets that is sold on the market. Okay, so that's that one. How do you estimate trends of past royalties? When the dollar rate is short, the volatility is too high to estimate trends, and when the dollar rate is long, the trend is usually down. So yeah, I mean, we use exclusively the prior earnings history for determining trends. And that's the only way that we can really do it. And yeah, the dollar age is a big contributing factor, like Dayton got into earlier. Lower dollar age catalogs, the continuation of that earnings life is highly variable. Like it could drop all the way off 95% decline, or it could be a steady decline. It could even increase in some cases, depending on where it is in its earnings life and what's going on with it. So There's no way to really know. Dayton, you have anything else you want to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see the expectations of future value for these different assets based on the dollar age in the pricing that's tied to them. Because there's a lot of volatility in a lower dollar age asset, that's likely going to be valued by people on the platform as less valuable than something with a higher dollar age. I will say it is not necessarily the case that when a dollar age is long that the trend is usually down. Depending on the age of the asset, given, and especially now, I think, given how consumption habits of people who listen to music have changed with streaming being a dominant format and on demand being a function of that, at a certain point, it is not unreasonable to expect with an asset that has a high enough dollar age for the performances to remain relatively consistent. And if that's the case, then you could expect for that kind of asset that is driven by streaming royalties to increase in value over time as the streaming services that it's on increase in value over time. So it, not necessarily down, depending on how old that asset is.
Right. And that really speaks to, the tail of earnings and the consistency, as it were, that we typically see with higher dollar age stuff.
Yeah. I mean, not a music asset and definitely kind of an outlier example, but you can take a look at the listing that we have up for Listerine. And that's something that's 140 years old. And you can look and see how consistent the earnings are for that kind of asset over time. Again, maybe not a representative example, but that's a case where that's something that's been around for over a century and it's still generating consistent income.
Actually growing. I think it's around like a 4% growth, something like that. So take that as you will. Okay, next one here. Do your analyst benchmark reports factor in inflation, or do they pretend that that is not a factor? Well, again, the analyst benchmark is just median sale price. So it's a pretty simple look at prior transactions on Royalty Exchange. So yeah, it wouldn't factor in inflation or anything like that. It's just pretty simple.
Yeah, the benchmarks are updated on an ongoing basis. So I think that if we see sometime we look in a year or 2 or 3, 4 now, and that inflation and interest rates have had some kind of effect on what these assets are going for on our platform, that would be borne out in the analyst benchmark.
Next question here. If the investment is passive, why is it taxed as ordinary income? Rob, you want to talk about taxes some more?
No, this honestly is probably a better question for the IRS, but it's on a 1099 MISC. It's lumped in with rents, royalties, fishing boat proceeds, some kind of weird stuff, but that's just kind of how it's lumped in on. If you want to check it out, it's 1099 MISC is the form that they reported on.
Next question here. Oh, this is the last one of the submitted ones. Do you take a percentage of the distributions as a fee, or is 100% distributed? We do not take any percentage of royalties for our admin service. It is a free service we provide. There is no percentage carry. There's no ongoing fee. The only fees that Royalty Exchange takes on a transaction basis. So yeah, what you receive is 100% of what we were paid for the royalty that you own. So that's 100% of whatever it is that you were entitled to for your purchase. Okay, so that is the Q&A. I do see there's some chats that came in. We'll take a quick look at these. So is Royalty Exchange a vehicle for the sale of royalties, basically a facilitator? Yes, we are effectively a marketplace, plain and simple. So we are a platform where people can buy and sell, transact as they need for royalties. So yeah, we are just a platform for sale. Could you walk us through a basic search by price? Jason, I can do that with you. Let's set up a one-on-one at some point this week, and we can go through searching on the exchange and all that stuff. That's probably going to be the easiest way to do it rather than on this webinar. So I'll shoot you an email and we can get that set up. What's the significance of dollar age? We've covered that quite a bit. If the investment is passive, why is it tax-ordinary income? We covered that. Can you explain again the difference between standing orders and other types of orders? Yeah, so our standing order function is effectively our automated investing feature. So the way this works is if you're setting a standing order, you set the earnings parameters that you would be comfortable paying for a catalog. But the important is that the important aspect is that these are blind purchases. So the theory is that as long as the earnings metrics fit with what your investment profile is and what you're going for, then the specifics of the catalog shouldn't matter. And this does hold pretty true in that we don't see a whole lot of difference in earnings performance based on genre and things like that. So it's things like dollar age, last 12 months earnings, and term length. You can set pretty consistent returns profiles for those. And so that's how the standing orders work. Now, you have different access depending on your account with us. So all access members have full reign of standing orders. You have no dollar cap. You can set for any term length you want, but just for base verified investors, you can only do 10-year term deals and only orders up to $25,000. It's really a feature for the all access members, but we provide provisional access to any investor just so they can try it out, see if they like it. So that's effectively how the standing orders work. And this one, yeah, Jason will chat and we'll get you all taken care of there. Okay, any last questions that anyone still on the call has? We've gone through everything that we have here. I'll give you guys a minute just to see if you want to formulate any last questions, but other than that, we can call this webinar complete. So just sit tight for a minute. If you've got a question, send it in a Q&A. Going once. Going twice. Okay. All right, well, thank you all for coming. I hope that this was all helpful. If you guys have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are very accessible, always happy to talk about this stuff, answer questions, help with, as you need. Again, my name is John Gestel. I am our client relations coordinator here with Dayton O'Connor, who is our lead analyst, and then Rob Bernhardt, who is our corporate counsel. Again, this is being recorded and will be posted on the blog page if you'd like to review it, if you missed the beginning, anything like that. So keep an eye out for it there, and have a great rest of your weeks and rest of your days. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.